LeBron James starts by saying Horace Grant is one of those players history rarely pauses for, even though dynasties were built on his shoulders. LeBron explains that when people talk about the Bulls, they jump straight to Jordan and Pippen, but forget the man doing the dirty work every night guarding bigger bodies, setting bruising screens, and anchoring the defense without ever demanding the spotlight. Stephen Curry adds that Horace Grant played in an era where toughness wasn't optional. It was survival. There was no spacing, no freedom of movement, just elbows, bodies, and pain. Steph says Grant didn't have the luxury of finesse. His job was to absorb punishment so others could shine, and that kind of roll slowly wears a man down, physically and mentally. LeBron then shifts the tone, talking about the tragedy of being essential but invisible. He says Horace Grant sacrificed personal numbers for team success, and because of that, his greatness never translated into headlines. LeBron notes how hard it is to accept being overlooked while knowing you're doing everything right, especially when championships are won, but recognition never comes. Steph brings up Grant's battles with injuries, especially the toll on his knees and body from years of relentless physical play. He explains that Horace played through pain that today's fans can't imagine, often knowing one more hard fall could shorten his career. Steph calls that a silent tragedy, playing hurt so your team doesn't fall apart. LeBron talks about the emotional weight of leaving Chicago and being blamed during the Bulls' struggles without Jordan. He says Grant became an easy target, unfairly criticized, as if the dynasty collapsing was his fault. LeBron relates this to how role players often carry blame while stars are protected by legacy. Stephen Curry then highlights how Horace Grant finally found peace and validation in Orlando, winning another title with the Lakers later, proving he was never just a system guy. Steph says that moment mattered. It showed Grant's value wasn't tied to one superstar, even if history tried to frame it that way. LeBron closes by saying Horace Grant represents every great player who paid the price so legends could rise. He says championships don't exist without men like Grant, even if statues and documentaries forget them. LeBron calls Horace a reminder that greatness isn't always loud, and sometimes the real tragedy is being unforgettable to teammates, but forgettable to history. Stephen Curry ends by saying that if Horace Grant played today, fans would finally understand his value. Advanced stats, spacing, and appreciation for defense would expose just how vital he was. Steph says the game has evolved, but Horace Grant was ahead of his time, a winner who gave everything and asked for nothing. LeBron says one of the hardest parts of Horace Grant's career was understanding his value while the world debated it. He explains that when you're the one doing the work nobody wants to do, praise rarely follows. Grant wasn't asked to score 30 or take game-winning shots. He was asked to make sure others could. Stephen Curry reflects on how Grant's glasses became symbolic, not just a look, but a reminder of how vulnerable players really are. Steph says those goggles weren't style, they were protection. Proof that Horace was already fighting through physical limitations, while still throwing his body into chaos every night. LeBron talks about the pressure of guarding dominant big men. In an era built on brutality, he says Horace Grant battled giants with no fear, knowing every matchup would leave bruises and scars. LeBron calls that a form of courage most fans never recognize because it doesn't show up on highlight reels. Steph adds that Grant's offensive role was intentionally muted, even though he had skill. He says Horace could score, pass, and read the game, but winning demanded sacrifice. Steph points out how hard it is for a player to silence their own ambition. For the sake of chemistry, LeBron pauses and mentions how Grant was often judged by what he wasn't instead of what he was. He says fans criticize him for not being flashy, not being dominant enough, not being loud. LeBron calls that unfair, because the system worked precisely because Horace accepted his role without ego. Stephen Curry brings up how Grant's departure from Chicago exposed how fragile legacies really are. Suddenly, the same fans who cheered him questioned his loyalty. Steph says that moment shows how quickly love turns to blame when narratives change. LeBron connects that to modern players, saying Horace Grant lived through the early version of what stars face today, public judgment without context. He says Grant didn't have social media to defend himself, no platform to explain his side, just silence and criticism. Steph reflects on Grant's mental toughness, saying it's harder to stay locked in when appreciation fades. He explains that Horace kept showing up, kept doing the work, even when respect didn't follow him into new locker rooms. Steph calls that professionalism at its purest form. LeBron then speaks about the emotional toll of being overshadowed by legends. He says playing next to icons can erase your identity if you let it. Grant never complained, never demanded recognition, but that doesn't mean the weight wasn't heavy. Stephen Curry adds that Horace Grant was the kind of teammate every superstar needs. but rarely celebrates publicly. He says Grant communicated on defense, covered mistakes, and stabilized chaos. Steph calls him the glue that doesn't get credit when things stick together. LeBron recalls watching film of those Bulls teams and noticing how often Grant was in the right place before the play even developed. He says that's basketball intelligence anticipation built through discipline, not talent alone. Steph says Grant's rebounding was an act of will, not height or bounce. He explains that Horace understood angles, timing, and positioning, beating more athletic players simply by wanting the ball more when it mattered. LeBron shifts to legacy again, saying Horace Grant's story reminds players that rings don't guarantee respect. He explains that history sometimes simplifies dynasties into 2 or 3 names, erasing the foundation beneath them. Stephen Curry says that when younger fans ask about unsung heroes, Horace Grant should be one of the first names mentioned. He calls Grant a blueprint for winning basketball, even if the blueprint was never signed. LeBron emphasizes that Grant paid the physical price long after the banners were raised. He says the pain followed him beyond retirement, a reminder that championships demand more than applause, they demand sacrifice that lingers. Steph ends the stretch by saying Horace Grant's tragedy wasn't failure, it was invisibility. He succeeded at the highest level, but the story skipped over him. Steph says remembering players like Grant is how the game stays honest. LeBron closes by saying that without Horace Grant, basketball history reads differently. Dynasties don't survive without men willing to disappear so greatness can stand taller, and that, he says, is Horace Grant's true legacy. LeBron follows that thought by pointing out that Grant's impact wasn't just physical, but psychological. He notes that in a locker room with personalities as dominant as MJ and Phil Jackson, you need a stabilizer, someone who doesn't react to the fire, but absorbs the heat. LeBron says that Grant was the emotional shock absorber for those early Bulls teams, a role that requires a level of maturity most players don't reach until their 30s. Yet Horace was doing it in his mid-20s. Stephen Curry nods, adding that if you look at Grant's skill set today, he'd be the ultimate unicorn role player. Steph points out that Grant's mid-range jumper was automatic, a lost art that would be a deadly weapon in today's pick-and-pop game. He says we talk about spacing now like it's a new invention, but Horace was providing vertical and horizontal spacing back when the paint was as crowded as a subway station, often sacrificing his own open looks to keep the lane clear for others. LeBron reflects on the 1995 playoffs, calling it a moment of truth for Grant's legacy. He explains that when Horace went to Orlando and helped beat a returning Michael Jordan, it wasn't out of spite, but a quiet demonstration of self-worth. LeBron says that seeing Horace carried off the floor on his teammates' shoulders after that series was one of the few times the world actually saw him for what he was, a winner who changed the gravity of whatever room he walked into. Steph adds that this specific moment in Orlando proved Horace wasn't just a product of the Bulls triangle. He notes how Grant mentored a young Shaq and Penny Hardaway, providing the veteran championship DNA that a young franchise desperately needed. Steph says that's the highest compliment you can pay a player, that their presence alone elevates the ceiling of an entire organization, regardless of who the superstar is. LeBron shifts back to the physical reality of Grant's era, mentioning how he played 80 games a year while banging with legends like Ewing, Mourning, and Shaq. He says the load management of today is a luxury Horace earned for the next generation, but never got to taste himself. LeBron calls it a debt of gratitude the modern league owes to the enforcers of the 90s, who traded their mobility in their 50s for the league's growth in the 90s. Stephen Curry brings up the power of the four, explaining that Horace redefined what a power forward was supposed to be. He wasn't just a bruiser, and he wasn't just a shooter. He was a hybrid before the term existed. Steph says that Horace's ability to switch onto guards and stay in front of them would make him a max contract player in today's switch-heavy defensive schemes, proving once again that he was a man out of time.